Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a privilege to rise today to speak in support of Bill C-56, the Combating Counterfeit Products Act. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to advise this House that my remarks today mark a unique occasion when a Member of Parliament can stand in this House and speak on a government bill on important public policy that he or she spent a considerable amount of time advocating for in their life before politics. I spent several years of my professional life as a lawyer combating the rise of counterfeit goods and its impact on public safety and our economy. I'm also extremely proud to now be part of a government moving to address the negative consequences of the scourge of counterfeit goods. I will use part of my time to talk about this experience because I think it's important for this House to hear real-world accounts from the private sector, to hear why this legislation is needed. I hope to show my colleagues that the inaction or delay suggested by my friends in the NDP is simply not acceptable. The member for Timmins James Bay mentioned several times the challenges of litigation tonight in debate, and that's something I'll touch upon because I've led such litigation efforts in this area. Counterfeit goods are putting public safety at risk. Counterfeit goods are impacting economic activity and revenues. Counterfeit goods can lead to job losses for Canadians. Counterfeit goods and the proliferation of trademark infringement, passing off, and privacy have also become some of the fastest growing sources of revenue for organized crime. Mr. Speaker, for many years I was the in-house corporate lawyer for Procter & Gamble in Canada. Not only is P&G a respected global company with branded products that Canadians use in their homes every day, they are also the largest private sector employer in Eastern Ontario. With manufacturing facilities in Belleville and Brockville, Ontario, and head office operations in Toronto, P&G employs thousands in Ontario and makes products in Ontario that are shipped across North America and indeed, Mr. Speaker, across the world. It might surprise this House to learn that every Swiffer pad made in the world was made in Brockville, Ontario, just an hour from here. These are important manufacturing jobs in Ontario. They're also critically important to the global economy and trade, and jobs like these in Canada and around the world are put at risk with counterfeit goods. It was estimated at the time I worked there that the scourge of counterfeit goods cost P&G close to $1 billion annually in lost revenue. In these challenging economic times, that's $1 billion that's not invested in innovation, investment, or job creation. And this is just the impact on one employer. Multiply that literally by hundreds of companies and employers that sell or distribute branded products across Canada. In 2006, I was confronted with the ugly face of counterfeit goods in my job. And everything I will talk about highlight the excellent work P&G and other companies in the industry did to raise these issues. I should also add that I'm not violating any solicitor-client privilege. I'm talking about publicly known information. While the company had long worked with law enforcement to investigate counterfeit batteries and some isolated personal care products being counterfeited and sold in Canada, a public health advisory from Health Canada on counterfeit toothbrushes led me to devote considerable time and energies to this file. This advisory came about when a Canadian purchased a counterfeit toothbrush at a value vendor and choked on the bristles that came dislodged when they began brushing. For such a seemingly innocuous product, there was a serious risk of health because of the fact that counterfeit goods contain unknown ingredients or materials, they were made improperly, have no quality assurance, and were often manufactured in unhygiene surroundings. Only a few months earlier, counterfeit Colgate toothpaste in the U.S. was found to contain antifreeze. These events led me to create a brand protection team for Canada. I was fortunate to have Rick Kotwa, a 30-year OPP veteran and head of security for the country, to lead our investigative efforts. I was also lucky to have Jennifer Kazabun, an extremely sharp regulatory scientist that helped keep public safety and regulatory issues at the forefront of what we developed as a brand protection program. The president of the company at the time, Tim Penner, saw how important this issue was for the company, and he empowered our team to investigate and isolate counterfeit distributors across Canada. Over the next few years, we worked diligently on these issues, and we were truly astounded by the size of the counterfeiting problem in Canada and indeed throughout the world. With the backing of a terrific corporate leader like Tim Penner, P&G spent considerable resources pursuing investigation and litigation against distributors and retailers in Canada, despite the fact that we knew we would rarely be able to collect damages or our costs. The company took a leadership position, like many did, in this fight against counterfeit products. What became clear to me very quickly, Mr. Speaker, was that the laws and regulatory structures in Canada needed to radically evolve to address this new and growing risk to public safety and the criminal activities related to it. So I began to work directly alongside the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Retail Council of Canada, the Food and Consumer Products Council, and the special purpose organization created for this very issue, the Canadian Anti-Counterfeiting Network. I'd like tonight to thank these organizations and their member companies for championing these issues for many years. At these meetings, I got to know many of them, and particularly Lauren Lipkiss, someone who for more than a decade has been a lean, mean counterfeit busting machine and has raised public awareness more than anyone else in Canada on this issue. Thank you to these people, and our government is listening with Bill C-56. The Canadian Anti-Counterfeiting Network released its Roadmap for Change on Counterfeiting and Piracy in 2007, Mr. Speaker. CACN, industry, and employers across Canada have engaged with government in the years since 2007. There have been several years of careful consideration and consultation on these issues at a variety of levels. Our government has listened, and Bill C-56 attempts to address the public safety risks and economic damage caused by counterfeiting. While the NDP continually rise tonight to say that more time is needed to explore or debate these issues, I say that the time to act is now. Mr. Speaker, our government has been listening, particularly to Canadian employers and their industry groups, and documents like the Roadmap. And I want to highlight just a few specific sections from the Roadmap that are addressed by Bill C-56. I'll remind this House that the Roadmap was released in 2007. The Combating Counterfeit Products Act will provide better tools to investigate commercial counterfeiting and help to reduce trade in counterfeit goods by providing new enforcement tools to strengthen Canada's existing enforcement regime. These are specifically cited as recommendations 1.1 and 1.2 in the Roadmap. The Act will provide new criminal offenses for the commercial possession, manufacture, or trafficking of trademark counterfeit goods, recommendation 1.4. The Act will create new offenses for trademark counterfeiting, equipping law enforcement and prosecutors with the tools they've been asking for to combat this problem. That's recommendation 4.1 from the Roadmap. Finally, the last I'll highlight is this Act will give border officers the authority to detain suspected shipments and contact the intellectual property rights holders. They'll be able to do this because these intellectual property rights holders will be able to file a request for assistance with Canada Border Services Agency, in turn enabling border officers to share information with intellectual property rights holders regarding suspect shipments so they can be tracked. This addresses recommendations 6.2 and 6.4, Mr. Speaker. This bill is indeed the culmination of several years of consultations and direct advocacy from Canadian employers and industry groups like the Canadian Anti-Counterfeiting Network and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, amongst others. I've highlighted specific portions of this proposed legislation that have come directly from these consultations. Mr. Speaker, Canadians must know that purchasing counterfeit goods is not a victimless crime. That purse, those watches, fuel criminal activity. Counterfeit goods actually feed criminal networks around the world and is fast becoming the lifeblood for these organizations that in turn bring tremendous harm and oppression to people in Canada and around the world. In the last few years, Mr. Speaker, Interpol has connected directly profits from counterfeit goods sales to the funding of terrorism. In 2005, Mr. Speaker, the RCMP declared organized crime to be the primary actor in the field of counterfeit goods sale and distribution in Canada. In 2005, Mr. Speaker, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, at the Security Prosperity Partnership meetings, addressed this issue as a major economic and public safety issue that fuels organized crime across North America. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to also note in 2006 that the U.S. Trade Representative placed Canada on the special 301 watch list for the 12th consecutive year. That's a trade watch list because the intellectual property rights regime and regulatory structures in Canada were deemed inadequate. I might note that in 2006, that was the 12th year, almost perfectly coinciding with the previous Liberal government's time in office. Our laws and regulations had not been addressed in a generation, Mr. Speaker, and criminal organizations were taking advantage of our weakness, and our trade partners were demanding that we get serious. Bill C-56 is part of our effort to get serious on combating counterfeit goods. Since our government came to office in 2006, we listened to employers, including the CACN and other groups, consulted through roadmap documents and various public groups and forums, and what has been produced is Bill C-56. It's a balanced attempt to update our intellectual property rights regime in Canada. Now, going back to what got me into this area, Mr. Speaker, that Canadian that was fooled into buying the counterfeit brush that steered my career down this path was fooled because the criminals were literally stealing the goodwill associated with Procter & Gamble's toothbrush brand. The intellectual property behind the brand, from the trademarks to the industrial designs, were being used by criminal organizations to trick people into buying shoddy products that had not been manufactured in the way the brand would expect. These criminal groups could then funnel these profits into other criminal enterprises and even terrorist activities around the world. Mr. Speaker, in the last few years when I became aware of this issue, just to talk about a few areas that have scared me literally out of sleep, the dog food crisis years ago in Canada, many believe was fueled by counterfeit ingredients from a Chinese producer. Counterfeit electrical goods have been seized and found by the Canadian Standards Association, not just before being put in homes and hospitals, but after they've been installed, where counterfeiters have stolen the intellectual rights and trademarks that the CSA use in their seal, and that electricians across this country have learned to trust when they install things in people's homes. Electrical goods, Mr. Speaker, are counterfeited. Aircraft and military parts in the U.S. have been found to be counterfeit, not only putting the life of the operators, the men and women in uniform, at risk, but putting people in and around their use at risk as well. This problem is vastly greater than a handbag or a watch, Mr. Speaker. It's public safety, first and foremost, and it's combating organized crime on a secondary level. This bill will give border officers additional tools to work with government partners, Health Canada, the RCMP, as well as intellectual property rights holders, to better ensure that commercial shipments are free from harmful counterfeit goods or from counterfeit labels. Any provenance that does not meet these standards or affect intellectual property rights will be maintained, investigated, and will not be permitted to get out to the Canadian consumer. We also, Mr. Speaker, need to protect intellectual property in Canada to allow our businesses to invest, innovate, and create jobs. The last time, Mr. Speaker, that the Trademarks Act in Canada was substantially updated was in 1954. There are a range of there are now a wide range of possibilities for businesses to differentiate themselves, and this bill recognizes the new and innovative ways that businesses use intellectual property to distinguish their goods and services from those of competitors. These rights holders are employers, Mr. Speaker, and employs thousands of Canadians across our country. Protecting their intellectual property rights protects jobs. Sounds, scents, holograms, position marks, colors, numerals, figurative elements, three-dimensional shapes, textures, and now even taste are commonplace in the world of intellectual property. This bill will explicitly allow for registration of these non-traditional trademarks, giving them the same level of protection as a traditional mark. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the bill improves the reliability of information found in the trademark register, and it simplifies the overall trademark registration process by streamlining some of the requirements, and removing all impediments to the use of electronic documents. It is important for Canada to have a trademark register that is accurate and up to date. This bill will allow the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, or CIPO, to easily and quickly correct blatant and obvious errors after registration, instead of the intellectual property rights holder having to go through the time and expense of seeking an order from the federal court. While the central focus of this bill is the criminal, civil, and border enforcement measures, there must be a high level of legal certainty that a legitimate owner's registered trademark is valid in order to get the most out of that regime. By streamlining certain registration procedures, this bill will ensure a high level of effectiveness, efficiency, and validity for Canadian trademark owners while saving them time and money in the process. For example, if a Canadian business owner wishes to register his or her trademark that was previously registered in another country, they will no longer need to provide certified copies of the foreign registration as proof. This will save both time and money, as applicants will no longer have to contact the foreign intellectual property office and pay a fee to obtain a certified copy. In opposition proceedings, an applicant must reply to a statement of opposition with a counterstatement that responds to each allegation. With this bill, the counterstatement need only state that the applicant intends to respond to the opposition, thereby lessening the burden on applicants when the opposition is first filed. Rules on registrability of a trademark will be made clearer. A key element in trademark law is that a trademark must be distinctive. That is, it must be capable of distinguishing the goods and services of the business from those of other businesses. This bill will ensure that any trademark that is registered will meet the distinctiveness requirement. Currently, an application for a certification mark, which guarantees that a good or service meets certain standards, must be based on actual use. This bill will allow application for certification marks based on proposed use, thereby harmonizing with the approach taken by other types of trademarks. In 1954, the last time this act was touched, it's difficult to imagine the electronic communication and dissemination of documents would be so prevalent. So the Trademarks Act and its provisions were very much paper-based. This bill removes paper requirements and allows for the filing and handling of all documents electronically. Mr. Speaker, I can't assure this House enough that Bill C-56 is not only critical to the public safety of Canadians, whether they brush their teeth in the morning, feed their pet, or turn on their lights, they need to know that the marks and seals that they've come to trust are legitimate, and that people abusing that trust will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But, Mr. Speaker, we also must recognize by shutting this door to counterfeiters, we are also shutting the door to criminal organizations that have quickly moved in and found the margins and the ability to operate by stealing the intellectual property of Canadian employers, allows them a means to fuel their criminal organizations and activities, including terrorism, Mr. Speaker, that our government spends millions of dollars combating. This bill is a good attempt at getting our regime updated. We've listened to industry, Mr. Speaker, and I'd be pleased to answer questions or comments from my colleagues on this important legislation.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? Honorable député de Longueuil-Pierre-Boucher.
Merci, M. le Président. J'aimerais tout d'abord sincèrement féliciter mon collègue pour son discours. Je pense que ça fait du bien d'entendre quelqu'un qui est assez pragmatique et qui arrive d'un passé professionnel qui amène un éclairage pertinent. Et dans cette jeunesse, dans son nouvelle arrivée au Parlement, j'y verrai là peut-être l'origine de sa candeur devant le côté consultatif des procédures de notre gouvernement d'en face, puisqu'il est bien connu qu'il est fort peu de nature à consulter les gens reliés à des idées qu'ils peuvent avoir quant aux réglementations qui les appliquent. Mais une question plus brûlante d'actualité, est-ce qu'il ne trouve pas déplorable de voir que toute cette belle théorie va être difficile à appliquer lorsqu'on voit qu'hier même, le ministre du Patrimoine a jugé pertinent de s'immiscer dans les négociations de travail à l'Agence des services frontaliers du Canada.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the honourable mention not only for his question, but his very kind comments in welcoming me while I physically sit on his side of the House. I'm not from his side of the House, but I also appreciate my colleagues in all the seats in this place, Mr. Speaker. I think the root of his question highlights the reason why there was such inaction by the previous Liberal government on these important issues at the border and in terms of trademarks specifically. A transition in some parts of this act, including modernizing trademarks law and empowering an intellectual property registry at the border, are going to be substantial changes. The honourable member is correct in that regard, but the challenge on modernizing does not excuse us from not acting. So the previous Liberal government spent 12 years, each year Canada being named as a special trade country to watch alongside other countries like China and Saudi Arabia, just because it was difficult. Our government has looked at this seriously in the last few years, Mr. Speaker, and this bill is an important step to update our laws.
In comments, questions et commentaires, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend from Durham. It is indeed a treat to have someone speak to a bill for which they advocated before political life. I'm curious about some aspects of this bill, and I wish we had more time to deal with it. I agree it's important legislation, and the goals of the bill are laudatory. But the bill is giving custom officers the kind of powers that we really only see in the hands of judges. Customs officers are going to have to make quick determinations at the border about what's counterfeit, what's legitimate, what might be a parallel import, and they're going to have to do it on the spot, and they're going to have to get it right. And I'm wondering, are the recourses available to, say, an honest importer whose goods are seized by a customs officer with these increasingly large and, I think, quite complex and difficult responsibilities?
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands. I find that when I'm speaking late at night in this House, she's always joining me in this House with intelligent comments. But as leader of her party, she should really speak to her House leader about her House duty hours. They seem to be potentially that, or she works very hard. It could be the latter, Mr. Speaker. But she's raised a very good issue. This will be a new series of powers, but we're also not dealing here with human crossing of the border. These are esoteric type rights in intellectual property, but they're important rights. And the determination at the border can be made by trained officials using a registry that allows intellectual property rights holders to register their marks. It will also put a new burden of seriousness on importers to get their bill of lading and to get their importation documents correct. I think sloppiness could lead to a slowdown in goods coming in. But being intellectual property and being a border issue, there will always be recourse through our federal courts, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires de l'honorable député de la Salle-et-Mauve.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je suis très contente de me lever, premièrement, pour remercier le député de Durham pour un discours très informatif et très intéressant. Ça me fait regretter, en fait, que le leader parlementaire des conservateurs ait mis le bâillon sur ce débat qui est très intéressant pour pouvoir discourir sur ce projet de loi. Il l'a mentionné et je l'appuie. Je l'appuie. C'est un projet de loi qui est très important. Il a bien décrit aussi son travail. J'étais totalement intéressée à savoir comment la compagnie Procter & Gamble, pour laquelle il travaillait, a fait l'estimation des pertes de 1 milliard de dollars si je comprends bien, en contrefaçon, là, des pertes. Comment ça a été évalué et est-ce que cela comprenait Procter & Gamble au niveau international ou seulement au Canada? Alors ça, ça serait vraiment important. Et également, j'aimerais qu'il élabore un peu parce qu'il a mentionné à quelques reprises que le projet de loi C-56 est une tentative de régler ce problème-là. Alors, j'aimerais ça, il met un doute dans ma chose, alors il y aurait des choses à améliorer. J'aimerais qu'il élabore également là-dessus. Merci.
The honorable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from LaSalle for her questions and for carefully listening to my remarks tonight. She asked a few things, and I'd be happy to address the first one quickly. The debate has been had, in fact, in many ways. I think she mildly heckled when I spoke, saying 2006 or 2007 was some time ago. Industry have been asking for these intellectual property updates for that long of time. And I think our government has consulted broadly. We've followed a balanced approach that addresses border issues, the intellectual property rights regime, and we've acted. In terms of her question about P&G, it's interesting. All of these things are estimated because counterfeiting really is like an iceberg. You will only see 1/4 of that iceberg above the water, and the rest is below. So estimates were made by the amount of counterfeit goods seized, and approximation that you're not going to catch everything. And I think why I'm saying this is a balanced start is law enforcement, now that we're giving powers, now that we're criminalizing some of this conduct, they will have to, over time, improve their own investigative techniques. Border officials will have to improve their investigative techniques to try and stay ahead of the counterfeiters. So inaction, though, is going to hurt employment. It's going to hurt employers, so we need to act.
The questions and comments, the honorable member from Tobeke-Mataquac.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his comments. And it was a very good discussion, and really valued the experience he brought to the debate here tonight. One of the things there's been some discussion about, the Border Services Agency's ability to handle this type of thing, and I just wonder if he might comment that, as he would know, in the bill, there's the request for assistance that's actually received from the copyright owner to CBSA, who then would do a seizure, typically like they would any commercial good at the border, which they're typically used to today. And then it's the copyright owner who is their responsibility to address after they receive samples from CBSA. So to that point, it's not quite like the U.S. regime where there's a lot of training, but can you comment just about how that process mitigates a little bit of the risk for CBSA?
The honorable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Tobeke-Mataquac, particularly for his help in bringing me up to speed as a new member of his caucus. He's identified a couple of critical things that were lacking in our intellectual property enforcement regime, and trademark and intellectual property holders were asking for a registry and asking for assistance. I encountered instances where the border would find a shipment that had a personal care product in the container, but not contained on the manifest. And even though there were brands on those personal care products, border officials and law enforcement weren't able to notify the brand holder and weren't able to conduct investigations to really get to the root to where these products were going and what groups were distributing them across the country. These requests and this registry that CBSA will run are exactly what industry and rights holder have been asking for and will be a huge tool to combat this problem.